The alarm on the ceasefire station tore through the corridor before I had even finished my morning report. Red light bled across the walls. Somewhere below me, metal groaned under pressure it was never built to hold. I dropped my data slate and ran toward the sound, my forearms already reaching for a weapon I did not have, because observers are not permitted to carry one. Station Calis Vey was supposed to be neutral ground. 3 years of war between my people and the humans had finally worn both sides down to a single fragile agreement, and this station, spinning quietly at the edge of a dead system, was where that agreement was meant to be signed. Instead, on the very day the human delegation arrived, someone had planted a charge in the lower docking ring. I reached the observation deck in time to see the explosion bloom silently on the other side of the viewport, a flower of orange fire swallowed instantly by vacuum. The docking ring buckled. Warning lights swept across every panel in the control room. A young Chrysaxi technician beside me screamed a name I did not recognize, someone she must have loved, someone who had been working in that ring only minutes before. I had spent 3 years compiling a file on the woman my people feared more than any weapon we had ever built. Admiral Ellen Hartley. My superiors called her the Undertaker, because wherever her ship went, graves followed. I had read every account of her from soldiers who survived encounters with her fleet. I had built a picture in my mind of someone cold, precise, without mercy. I expected that when her ship finally arrived at this station, it would announce itself with weapons drawn, with threats spoken in a voice that did not waver. What arrived was worse, in its own way, because it was not what I expected at all. The human vessel, a slate-gray cruiser called the Widow's Grace, had been holding position outside the station when the explosion tore through the docking ring. I watched on the display as it moved, and it moved faster than I believed a ship that size could move, faster than protocol allowed inside a neutral zone. It should have waited for permission. It should have signaled first. Instead, it slid between the station and the drifting debris of the ring, using its own hull as a shield against a second wave of shrapnel that our sensors had only just detected. I did not understand, in that moment, why a warship captained by a woman my people feared would choose to protect us, instead of simply retreating to safety. I stood frozen at the viewport, watching pieces of the docking ring bounce harmlessly off gray hull plating that had been built to survive far worse. A voice came over the station's emergency channel, translated a half-second late by the system, but clear enough that I could hear the woman speaking beneath the translation. Her voice was calm in a way that felt unnatural for the situation, the way a surgeon might sound calm while a patient bled beneath her hands. This is Admiral Ellen Hartley of the Widow's Grace. We are reading 2 more charges inside the ring structure, both still armed. My teams are moving to disable them now. I need every person on that station away from the ring in the next 90 seconds. Please move. Please. I remember that word specifically, because no human voice in any account I had studied had ever used it. The Undertaker did not say please. The Undertaker gave orders, and worlds burned when they were ignored. I ran with the others, pushed by technicians and station guards toward the central corridor, away from the ring. Behind us, small craft detached from the Widow's Grace, 3 of them, moving with a precision that suggested years of practice rather than improvisation. I watched through a side viewport as human soldiers in heavy suits worked against the clock, cutting into damaged sections of the ring, where the remaining charges had been hidden. I should explain, for anyone who reads this account later and does not understand why a war scholar like myself was assigned to a ceasefire station instead of a battlefield. My work before the war was the study of other cultures, their histories, their patterns of behavior. When the fighting began, my skills were repurposed into something less academic and more urgent. I was tasked with understanding the enemy well enough to predict them. I built files. I read intercepted communications. I interviewed survivors of battles where human ships had appeared and left nothing behind but wreckage and silence. None of that work prepared me for what I saw next. The second charge detonated before the human team could reach it, a smaller explosion than the first, contained mostly within an already ruined section of the ring. But the shockwave rattled through the station's frame, and I heard metal scream somewhere above us, followed by the unmistakable sound of a support strut failing. A section of ceiling near the central corridor came down in a shower of sparks and debris, and beneath it, trapped between 2 collapsed beams, I heard a child crying. Not a human child, a Chrysaxi hatchling, one of the young ones being sheltered on the station while their parents served in what remained of the war. I had almost forgotten they were here, tucked away in a nursery wing, meant to be far from any danger. Somehow the collapse had reached them anyway. I moved toward the sound before I had decided to move, some instinct older than my training taking over. But I was not the first to arrive. A human soldier was already there, one of the ones who had been working the ring only minutes before, still in a scorched suit, helmet cracked along one side. She was smaller than the stories suggested. Human soldiers always seemed smaller in person than in the accounts that made them into monsters. She was pulling debris away from the opening with bare hands, ignoring the blood that ran down her fingers where the metal had cut her. I recognized her voice when she called back over her shoulder, the same calm tone from the emergency channel, though closer now, and rougher with effort. Admiral Hartley herself, on the ground, digging through wreckage for a child that was not her own species, that belonged to the side her fleet had been fighting for 3 years. I dropped to my knees beside her without thinking, and began pulling at the debris as well. She glanced at me once, just long enough to register that I was there, and said nothing about the fact that I was Chrysaxi, that I represented the very people whose ships had killed members of her own crew. She simply nodded, as if my help had been expected, and returned to the work. Together we pulled enough of the collapsed section away to reach the hatchling, a small, scaled creature no older than 4 cycles, its cries turning to frightened whimpers as we cleared the last of the debris. Hartley reached in first, careful, murmuring something in her own language that the child could not understand, but seemed to calm anyway. Some universal tone that needed no translation. She lifted the hatchling free and checked it over with quick, practiced hands. The same hands that had, according to every file I had built, ordered the destruction of 12 capital ships at the Battle of the Sindral Straits. The hatchling was unharmed, shaken but unhurt, and it clung to the front of her scorched uniform with small claws that could not have hurt her even if it tried. She held it against her shoulder the way I had seen Chrysaxi mothers hold their own young. An instinct she should not have had for a species not her own, and yet there it was. I want to be honest in this account, because I intend for it to be read by others who still believe what I believed before that day. I expected cruelty from humanity. I expected, at best, indifference. I did not expect an admiral with a fleet's worth of blood on her record to be kneeling in station wreckage with a Chrysaxi hatchling held against her chest, checking its breathing with the same care she might have shown one of her own crew. Around us, the emergency systems finally caught up, sealing off the damaged sections, restoring the artificial gravity that had flickered during the second blast. Station security arrived, along with more of Hartley's soldiers, and the immediate danger passed, though the question of who had planted the charges remained wide open, a threat still somewhere among us. Hartley stood, the hatchling still cradled against her, and looked at me properly for the first time. Her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last 10 minutes, the kind of tired that comes from years rather than hours.
"You are the one compiling reports on my movements,"
she said. It was not a question. I felt my throat tighten, caught between the instinct to deny it and the knowledge that lying to her now, after what I had just witnessed, would serve no purpose. "I am," I admitted. Veltharak Sen, war scholar, attached to the ceasefire delegation as an observer. She studied me for a long moment, the hatchling shifting against her shoulder, small claws finding purchase in the fabric of her uniform. Then, "Well," she said, "you can observe this. Someone just tried to kill a station full of children to stop a peace agreement from being signed. I would like to know why, and I suspect your people will trust your answer more than mine." I did not have a response ready for that. In every scenario I had imagined for meeting the Undertaker, I had never once imagined being asked for help, treated as a partner rather than an enemy to be assessed and contained. Behind her, more soldiers moved through the corridor, securing the area, checking for further charges, and I noticed something in the way they worked that matched nothing in my files. They were not moving like conquerors securing territory. They were moving like people trying to keep others alive, checking on Chrysaxi station staff with the same urgency they showed their own wounded. The hatchling in Hartley's arms had stopped crying entirely now, its wide eyes fixed on her face, with the particular trust that very young things give without reservation, before they learn caution, before the world teaches them who they are supposed to fear. I looked at that trust, and I looked at the woman my people had spent 3 years calling a monster, and for the first time since the war began, I did not know which story to believe. The council session, I would later learn, had already been delayed by the explosion, and would be delayed further by what came next. But standing there in the wreckage of the docking ring, with sirens still fading in the background, and a rescued hatchling clinging to the uniform of the woman I had been sent to study, I understood that whatever I wrote in my next report would need to be very different from anything I had written before. Hartley shifted the hatchling to one arm and extended her free hand toward me, an old human gesture of greeting that I recognized from my research but had never before been offered myself. I took it, my 4 fingers awkward against her 5, and she gripped my hand firmly, the way a soldier greets another soldier, rather than the way a conqueror greets the conquered. "Let us go find out who did this," she said, and there was something in her voice now that matched the reputation I had studied for 3 years, a steel underneath the calm that suggested the woman who dug through rubble for a stranger's child was entirely capable of hunting down whoever had endangered that child in the first place. I fell into step beside her as we moved down the corridor, the hatchling still watching me over her shoulder with wide, curious eyes, and I understood, walking away from that wreckage, that the story I had been sent to document was not the one I thought I would find. We passed through a checkpoint where 2 of her officers stood guard, a tall man with a shaved head who introduced himself as Captain Daniel Pierce, and a shorter woman with sharp eyes named Lieutenant Grace Bennett, who was already speaking into a comm unit, coordinating a search of the lower decks for any device that might have survived the blast undetected. Neither of them looked surprised to see their admiral carrying a Krazaxi hatchling. If anything, Bennett simply reached into a supply bag at her hip and produced a small woven blanket, the kind meant for human infants, and offered it without a word. Hartley wrapped it around the small, scaled shoulders without breaking stride. I found myself staring at that exchange longer than I should have. It was such a small thing, a blanket produced without hesitation, but it told me something my files never had. This was not a single act of unexpected kindness from one admiral in a moment of crisis. This was a crew that expected such moments, that carried supplies for children who were not their own, as a matter of habit rather than performance. Station security met us at the entrance to the administrative wing, led by a Krazaxi officer named Overseer Tull Braxis, whose scales had paled with the particular shock of someone who had almost lost people under his protection. He demanded to know why a human admiral was walking through secured Krazaxi territory, carrying a Krazaxi child, his voice rising with a mixture of fear and indignation that I understood completely, because I had felt the same confusion only minutes before. Hartley did not raise her voice in response. She simply held the hatchling a little more securely and explained, in plain terms, what had happened at the ring, what her teams had found, and what she believed it meant. Someone had planted 3 explosive charges in a structure meant to be neutral ground, timed to detonate during the arrival of a peace delegation. That was not the work of an opportunistic thief or a disgruntled worker. That was sabotage, aimed directly at the ceasefire itself. And whoever had done it did not care how many children were sleeping in the nursery wing above the ring. Braxis went very still when he heard that, his pale scales darkening again, this time with something closer to anger than fear. He knew, as I did, that among my own people there were factions who considered any peace with humanity to be a betrayal of everyone who had died in the war so far. I had heard whispers of such groups in my research, small and fractured, dismissed by my superiors as too disorganized to pose a real threat. Standing in that corridor, with the smell of scorched metal still clinging to the air, I no longer believed they were as disorganized as we had assumed. Hartley asked to see the nursery wing directly, and Braxis, after a moment of visible hesitation, agreed to escort her there himself. I walked with them, matching pace, my mind already working through the implications of what I had witnessed. If this was sabotage from within my own people, then my presence beside the human admiral was no longer simply an assignment. It was a liability, a vulnerability, because whoever had planted those charges might consider me a collaborator the moment they learned how closely I had begun working with her. The nursery wing, when we reached it, had been spared the worst of the damage, though the walls still trembled faintly from aftershocks running through the station's frame. A handful of caretakers stood near the entrance, counting heads, checking each hatchling against a list, their voices tight with the particular fear of people responsible for lives too young to protect themselves. Hartley handed the child in her arms to the nearest caretaker, with visible reluctance, murmuring something soft that the translator caught only partially. Something about being safe now, about counting all the small ones twice before anyone rested. The caretaker, an older Krizaxi woman with faded scales and careful hands, took the hatchling and studied Hartley's face for a long moment before speaking. She said only one word, in our own language rather than through translation, a word that meant something close to guardian, though it carried more weight than the human equivalent. It was not a word my people used lightly, and it was certainly not a word I had ever expected to hear directed at a human admiral inside a Krizaxi nursery. Hartley did not seem to understand the full weight of what had been said to her, but she nodded anyway, the universal gesture of acknowledgement, and turned back toward the corridor, back toward the investigation that still waited for her, back toward a war council that had no idea yet how close it had come to losing everything before it even began. I followed her out, aware that the report I would write that night would bear no resemblance to any report I had filed before, and aware, too, that whoever had planted those charges was still out there, watching, waiting to see whether the ceasefire would survive its first day. A second alarm cut through the station less than 2 hours later, sharper than the first, a proximity warning rather than a structural one. I was in the makeshift command room, set up beside the nursery wing when it sounded, and every head in that room turned at once toward the display showing the station's lower cargo hold, where sensors had just detected movement that matched no registered crew member on either side. Hartley was already moving before the second warning tone finished sounding. She had not slept, I realized, not once since the explosion in the ring, and yet she crossed the room with the sharp, unhurried speed of someone whose body had simply stopped needing rest for the moment. Captain Pierce fell in behind her, along with 2 more soldiers I had not yet met, their weapons drawn but held low, discipline rather than fear guiding their movements. I asked to come. I do not fully understand, even now, why I asked, except that something in me had shifted since the moment I watched her pull a Krizaxi child free of the wreckage with her own bleeding hands. Hartley glanced at me only once, and said that I could come if I stayed behind her soldiers, and did exactly what I was told. I agreed, and we moved together toward the lower decks, toward whatever had triggered the proximity sensors. The cargo hold sat 2 levels beneath the nursery wing, a wide chamber lined with storage containers, meant for supplies rather than people. The lights had been dimmed there since the earlier blast had damaged part of the power grid, and shadows pooled thick between the rows of containers as we entered. I heard my own breathing loud in my ears, 4 hearts instead of 1, working faster than they should have for a simple walk through a storage room. Bennett's voice came low over the comm channel, confirming that the movement had stopped near the far wall, close to a set of containers marked for medical supplies, the same supplies I had seen loaded onto the Widow's Grace before the ceremony was meant to begin. Hartley signaled for her team to spread, 2 soldiers moving left, 2 moving right, herself walking straight down the center aisle, with a confidence that made the hair along my scalp ridge rise in warning. We found them behind the 3rd row of containers. Not saboteurs, not assassins, but 2 more Krizaxi hatchlings, younger even than the one rescued from the ring, huddled together in the narrow gap between crates, clearly having wandered from the nursery during the chaos of the earlier evacuation and become lost in the unfamiliar dark of the lower decks. One of them was crying softly, the sound swallowed by the size of the room. The other simply stared at us with the wide, frightened eyes of a creature far too young to understand what danger even meant. I felt the tension drain out of the soldiers around me, almost as quickly as it had built, replaced by something gentler, something I recognized because I had felt it myself only hours before in the wreckage of the ring. Hartley knelt without hesitation, setting her weapon aside on the floor of the hold, an act that would have seemed reckless to my superiors, and yet felt, in that moment, entirely correct. She spoke to the 2 hatchlings in the same low, calm murmur I had heard her use before, words they could not understand carried on a tone that needed no translation. The crying one reached for her first, small clawed hands grasping at the fabric of her sleeve, and she lifted the child against her shoulder, with the same careful motion I had watched her use in the wreckage of the docking ring, as though she had done this 100 times before, though I knew for certain she had never held a Krizaxi hatchling before that day. The second child was more hesitant, pressing itself against the crate rather than reaching for anyone, and it was Pierce, the tall soldier with the shaved head, who crouched down slowly and offered an open hand, palm up, the way one might approach a frightened animal without meaning any disrespect by the comparison, because fear does not care what species wears it. The hatchling studied his hand for a long moment, before finally, tentatively, placing its own small claws against his palm, allowing itself to be lifted. I stood at the edge of that scene, watching two human soldiers cradle two Kryzaxi children in a half-lit cargo hold, and I understood that this was not a performance staged for my benefit. There had been no reason to expect a Kryzaxi observer in that hold, no reason to expect anyone at all, except the sensors that had detected movement, and the fear that movement might mean another bomb. It was Bennett who found the note. She had been sweeping the area for any sign of additional charges, methodical and thorough even with two rescued hatchlings changing the mood of the room, and she called Hartley over to a container near the back wall, one that had been pried open and resealed carelessly, as though someone had searched it in a hurry and not cared whether the tampering was noticed. Inside, beneath a false panel meant to look like standard packaging, was a data drive and a folded sheet of physical paper, an old-fashioned method that surprised me until I understood the reasoning behind it. Paper left no signal to trace, no digital trail for station security to follow back to its source. Whoever had hidden it there understood exactly how to avoid detection by modern means. Hartley read the note first, her expression unreadable, before passing it to me without a word. It was written in my own language, in a formal, educated hand that suggested someone with military training rather than a common criminal. The words were simple and cold. The peace agreement was a betrayal of every Kryzaxi who had died fighting humanity, and anyone who signed it, on either side, would be considered a traitor to be dealt with accordingly. It was signed only with a symbol, a stylized claw mark that I recognized immediately, though it took me a moment to place where I had seen it before. I told Hartley what I knew, that the symbol belonged to a faction calling itself the Unbroken Talon, a group my own government had dismissed for years as a fringe movement of veterans, too bitter to accept that the war had reached a stalemate neither side could win outright. I explained that I had read intercepted communications suggesting the group existed, but that my superiors had never considered them capable of anything beyond angry rhetoric broadcast on restricted channels. Hartley's expression did not change as I spoke, but something in her posture shifted, a stillness settling over her that I would come to recognize, over the following days, as the particular quiet she wore when she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation was happening around her. She asked whether the Unbroken Talon had access to Kryzaxi military hardware, and I admitted that if any of its members were former soldiers, as the note's formal handwriting suggested, then the answer was almost certainly yes. She handed the data drive to Bennett, instructing her to have it analyzed the moment the station's systems were fully restored, and then turned to look at the 2 hatchlings still cradled against her and Pierce, children who had wandered into the middle of a plot that intended, quite literally, to kill everyone attending the peace talks, meant to protect their future. "We need to move the children somewhere more secure," she said, "and I need to speak with your council before they hear a distorted version of what happened down here from anyone else." I found myself agreeing before I had fully considered what it meant to walk into a Kryzaxi war council beside a human admiral, effectively vouching for her judgment on a matter that could determine whether the ceasefire survived the day. As we climbed back toward the upper decks, the rescued hatchlings finally beginning to relax against the shoulders of the soldiers carrying them, I found myself thinking again of the files I had built over 3 years, the endless catalog of destruction attributed to the woman walking beside me. Somewhere in all those reports, I had never once considered the possibility that the same hands responsible for so much loss on the battlefield could be the same hands now gently supporting a frightened child's head so it would not strain its neck during the climb up a narrow stairwell. I did not yet understand what this meant for the story I would eventually tell. I only understood that the Unbroken Talon, whoever they were, had chosen the worst possible day to test the resolve of the woman my people had spent 3 years fearing, and that whatever they intended to do next, they would not find her distracted, and they would not find her alone. We reached the upper deck to find Overseer Braxis waiting for us, along with 2 members of the Kryzaxi War Council who had clearly been alerted to the second alarm and had come to investigate for themselves rather than wait for a formal briefing. One of them, a broad-shouldered general named Draxu Kell, looked at the two hatchlings still held by human soldiers with an expression I could not immediately read, something caught between gratitude and deep discomfort at seeing his own people's children carried by the enemy he had spent years fighting. General Kell demanded an explanation, and Hartley gave him one, without hesitation, laying out exactly what had been found in the cargo hold, the note, the symbol, the name of the faction I had identified. She did not soften the information to make it easier to hear, nor did she exaggerate it to make herself appear more capable than the situation required. She simply stated the facts as her team understood them, and let the weight of those facts speak for itself. Kell's reaction was not what I expected. I had prepared myself, walking up those stairs, for him to accuse Hartley of fabricating a threat to gain leverage in the negotiations, or worse, to suggest that the sabotage had been staged by humans themselves to justify continued military presence near the station. Both accusations would have been consistent with the rhetoric I had heard whispered among certain factions of our own military in the months leading up to the ceasefire. Instead, Kell simply asked to see the note himself, and when I handed it to him, his expression darkened in a way that told me he recognized the handwriting style, or at least the formal military training behind it, just as I had. He said a name under his breath, one I did not recognize, and Braxis went very still beside him. I asked who the name belonged to, and after a long pause, Kell explained that it belonged to a former strategist who had served under him early in the war, a soldier who had lost a mate and 2 children when a human strike hit a supply convoy that Kell himself insisted, even now, had not been carrying any weapons the humans could have detected in advance. The strategist had left military service 2 years ago, citing exhaustion, but Kell admitted he had heard rumors since then, quiet talk of the man organizing veterans who felt the war had been abandoned before it could be properly finished. Hartley listened to all of this without interrupting, and when Kell finished speaking, she asked a single question that told me she had already been thinking several steps ahead of the conversation the entire time. She asked whether this strategist would have had access to station schematics detailed enough to know exactly where to place explosive charges for maximum structural damage with minimum warning. Kell's silence was answer enough. It was decided, after some further discussion that I will not recount in full because much of it involved technical details of station security that hold little interest beyond their immediate purpose, that the Peace Council would reconvene within the hour, ahead of its original schedule, in order to address the sabotage attempt directly, rather than allow rumors to spread unchecked through the station. Braxis was tasked with overseeing a full sweep of every remaining cargo container and storage compartment, while Kell agreed, with visible reluctance, to have his own security teams work alongside Hartley's soldiers, rather than separately, a level of cooperation that would have been unthinkable only a day earlier. The 2 rescued hatchlings were finally handed over to a fresh set of caretakers, who fussed over them with the particular relief of people counting a blessing they had not expected to receive. I watched Hartley say something quiet to each child before they were carried away, the same gentle murmur I had heard twice already that day, and I found myself wondering how many other small kindnesses like this one had gone unrecorded in all the reports I had read about her, buried beneath the statistics of ships destroyed and territories reclaimed. As the corridor cleared, Hartley turned to me directly for the first time since we had left the cargo hold. She asked whether I would be willing to sit beside her during the reconvened council session, not as a formal observer taking notes for my own government, but as someone who could help translate not just language but intention, someone who understood the deeper currents running beneath the words that would be spoken in that chamber. I hesitated, because agreeing meant placing myself visibly and permanently on record as cooperating directly with the human delegation, a position that would follow me long after this ceasefire was either signed or abandoned. But I thought of the note hidden in that cargo container, the claw mark symbol signed by a man who had lost everything, and decided that meant everyone else deserved to lose it as well. And I thought of 2 hatchlings small enough to have wandered, frightened and lost, directly into the path of that same man's plan. I agreed. Hartley nodded once, the same economical gesture I would come to recognize as her version of gratitude, and turned to walk toward the council chamber, already composing in her mind, I suspected, exactly how she intended to address a room full of Chrysaxi leaders, who had spent 3 years being told she was the most dangerous thing in known space. I fell into step beside her, aware that whatever happened in that chamber, would determine far more than the fate of a single ceasefire, and aware, too, that somewhere on this station, a man who had lost his family to this war was watching, waiting to see whether his message had been received, and planning, almost certainly, something worse if it had not. The council chamber doors were already sealed by security when we arrived, a precaution that had never been necessary before that day, and the sight of armed guards standing at the entrance to what was supposed to be a room dedicated to peace told me more clearly than any briefing how quickly the mood on this station had shifted. Inside, the long curved table was already filling with delegates from both sides, Chrysaxi generals and human officers seated across from one another, with the particular stiffness of people who had trained their entire lives to see each other as targets, and were now expected to negotiate instead. I took my seat slightly behind Hartley, at her request, close enough to advise but positioned so that no one could mistake me for a formal member of either delegation. General Kell sat near the head of the Chrysaxi side, his expression carefully neutral now that the initial shock of the cargo hold discovery had passed, though I could see the tension still coiled in his shoulders. Across from him, an older human officer I had not yet met, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes named Colonel Margaret Ashby, watched the room with the patient stillness of someone who had sat through 100 difficult negotiations before this one. Hartley did not wait for a formal opening. She stood the moment the doors sealed and addressed the room directly, laying out everything that had happened since the ceremony was meant to begin: the explosion in the docking ring, the 2 additional charges her team had disarmed, the note found in the cargo hold, the symbol of the unbroken talon, and the name General Kell had recognized. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, and without a single wasted word, and I found myself understanding, watching her hold that room's attention, exactly why soldiers on both sides spoke of her with such weight in their voices. A representative from a smaller Chrysaxi delegation, a thin, sharp-voiced official named Vex Ordrin, who I knew from my research to be deeply skeptical of any peace with humanity, rose almost immediately to challenge her account. He suggested, his voice tight with barely restrained hostility, that the entire incident could easily have been staged by the humans themselves, a convenient excuse to justify keeping warships stationed near Chrysaxi territory, even after a ceasefire was signed. Several murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the Chrysaxi side of the table, old suspicions too deeply rooted to be erased by a single act of rescue in a collapsed corridor. I felt my own claws tighten against the edge of my seat, anticipating the moment Hartley would be forced to defend herself against an accusation that, 3 years ago, I might have made myself. But she did not raise her voice, did not grow defensive in the way I had expected. She simply turned toward me directly, in front of the entire assembled council, and asked whether I, as an independent Chrysaxi observer with no formal allegiance to the human delegation, believed the sabotage had been staged. The room went quiet. Every eye, human and Chrysaxi alike, turned toward me, and I understood in that moment that Hartley had done something both simple and devastating to Ordrin's accusation. She had not defended herself. She had handed the question to someone from my own people, someone with no reason to protect her reputation, and let my answer stand as evidence neither side could easily dismiss. I told the truth, because I had no other choice that would not have destroyed whatever trust remained between the 2 delegations. I explained what I had seen in the cargo hold, the handwriting on the note, the formal military training evident in its structure, the symbol I recognized from intercepted communications my own government had dismissed as harmless rhetoric. I explained that the strategist General Kell had named was a former Chrysaxi officer, not a human agent, and that the explosive charges used in the docking ring matched patterns consistent with Chrysaxi military training, rather than human technology. Ordrin's face darkened, but he did not immediately sit down. He asked, instead, why a human admiral would risk her own soldiers disarming charges meant to kill members of the peace delegation, suggesting that perhaps the entire rescue had been calculated for exactly this moment, a performance staged to win sympathy in front of the council. It was a cynical question, but not an unreasonable one, given everything my people had been told about humanity for 3 years of war. It was Colonel Ashby who answered this time, rising slowly from her seat on the human side of the table. She spoke of the 2 Chrysaxi hatchlings found in the cargo hold, children who could not possibly have been part of any staged performance, children whose fear had been entirely genuine, and whose safety had clearly mattered more to Admiral Hartley in that moment than any political advantage the rescue might later provide. She noted, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had served alongside Hartley for many years, that the Admiral had left her own weapon on the floor of that cargo hold in order to lift a frightened child, an act that made no tactical sense unless the concern behind it was entirely genuine. I watched the room absorb this, watched some of the hostility in Ordrin's posture begin to falter, though he was not yet ready to concede the point entirely. He turned instead toward a new line of attack, demanding to know what security measures Hartley intended to implement immediately to prevent further sabotage, framing the question as though the previous failure to prevent the first attack rested entirely on human shoulders, rather than being the work of a Krizaxi faction acting against its own government's wishes. Hartley answered this question as directly as she had answered every other, outlining a joint security protocol that would place human and Krizaxi soldiers together in every sensitive area of the station, a level of integration that had never been attempted during the war itself. She proposed that her own soldiers submit to searches by Krizaxi security personnel just as thoroughly as Krizaxi personnel would submit to searches by her own team, an offer that visibly surprised several members of the council, including General Kell, who had clearly expected the human delegation to insist on unilateral control over station security, given the circumstances. It was during this exchange that a runner burst into the chamber, breaking protocol so severely that 2 guards moved to intercept him before Braxis, recognizing the young Krizaxi technician, called them off. The runner, breathless and clearly frightened, reported that station sensors had detected an unauthorized transmission originating from somewhere within the lower decks, a signal broadcast on a restricted military frequency that matched no registered communication device on the station. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, demands for immediate lockdown competing with accusations flung across the table in both directions, 3 years of mutual suspicion boiling back to the surface in an instant. I watched Hartley's expression through the chaos, and I saw, for the first time since I had met her, something that might have been genuine alarm cross her features before she mastered it and raised her voice above the noise, calling for order, with an authority that silenced the room almost instantly. She asked the runner where exactly the transmission had originated, and the young technician, still catching his breath, named a maintenance corridor near the lower cargo hold, close to where the 2 hatchlings had been found only hours before. Hartley turned immediately to General Kell, and for the first time since the council session began, I saw something pass between them that looked almost like partnership. 2 commanders recognizing the same threat at the same instant, setting aside every year of hostility between their peoples because the danger in front of them mattered more than the history behind them. Kell rose without further debate and ordered his own security teams to move toward the maintenance corridor, and Hartley matched the order instantly, instructing Pierce and Bennett to take a squad of her own soldiers to meet them there. The joint response she had proposed only minutes earlier, now being tested for the first time under real pressure, rather than theoretical negotiation. I found myself rising as well, some instinct pulling me toward the door despite every reasonable argument for staying safely inside the sealed chamber. Hartley caught my arm as I moved past her, not to stop me, but to say quietly, meant only for me, that if the transmission was what she feared it might be, a signal meant to detonate something already hidden and waiting, rather than merely a communication between conspirators, then every second mattered more than protocol allowed for. She asked if I knew any other locations on the station where sensitive equipment might be stored close to the maintenance corridor, anywhere that a well-placed device could cause damage disproportionate to the size of the charge itself. I answered without hesitation, my mind already working through the station's layout from memory, and told her about the auxiliary power relay 2 levels below the maintenance corridor, a junction point that fed energy to nearly a third of the station including, I realized with a cold drop in my stomach as I said it aloud, the nursery wing, where the rescued hatchlings had just been returned to their caretakers. Hartley's expression did not change, but her pace did, and together we moved out of the council chamber and into a corridor filled with soldiers from both sides finally, for the first time in the war, moving toward the same danger with the same urgency, united not by treaty or diplomacy, but by the simple, immediate need to reach the children in that nursery, before whoever had sent that transmission could finish whatever they had started. We reached the auxiliary power relay in a matter of minutes, though it felt far longer, my forelegs struggling to match the pace Hartley set without seeming to strain at all. Pierce and Bennett's team had already secured the maintenance corridor above, finding it empty except for a small transmitter device wedged into a service panel, its work apparently already done by the time they arrived. That detail alone told Hartley everything she needed to know, and she said so aloud without slowing her pace, that a transmitter left behind after use meant a trigger signal already sent, which meant the device it was meant to activate was somewhere ahead of us, likely already armed. The relay chamber itself was a wide circular room lined with humming conduits, the air thick with the particular metallic smell of overworked machinery. General Kell's security team arrived only seconds after we did, and for a moment, the room held that same tension I had felt in the council chamber, old instincts warning both sides to view the other with suspicion, even as we all searched the same space for the same threat. Hartley cut through it immediately, directing half the combined force to search the upper conduits, while the rest checked the lower access panels, splitting the work by proximity, rather than by which uniform anyone wore. I found myself standing near Kell as the search began, and for the first time since the war started, I saw something like genuine fear in the general's face. Not fear of the humans beside him, but fear of what his own former officer might have hidden in a room that fed power directly to a wing full of sleeping children. He said quietly, more to himself than to me, that he had trained that strategist personally, had taught him tactics that were now, apparently, being turned against the very peace he claimed to still believe in. It was one of Kell's own soldiers who found it, a compact device tucked behind a coolant pipe near the base of the relay, small enough to have been easily missed by anyone not searching with deliberate care. The soldier called out immediately, and every person in that room froze at the sound of her voice, the particular stillness that comes when everyone understands simultaneously that the next few seconds matter more than almost any that came before them. Hartley moved toward the device without hesitation, and I felt my breath catch as Kell moved to stop her, insisting that his own people, more familiar with Krazaxi engineering, should be the ones to examine it. Hartley did not argue the point directly. She simply asked one of her own soldiers, a quiet young man named Corporal Ethan Vale who had said almost nothing since we entered the room, to step forward alongside Kell's engineer, and the two of them knelt together at the base of the relay, comparing notes in a mixture of broken Krazaxi and technical human terminology that neither fully understood, but both seemed to follow well enough for the task at hand. The minutes that passed while they worked felt endless. I found myself standing beside Hartley, close enough to hear her breathing, steady despite everything, and I asked her quietly whether she was afraid. It was not a question I had planned to ask, and I regretted it slightly the moment it left my mouth, uncertain whether it crossed some boundary of propriety between an admiral and an observer she barely knew. She answered anyway, without looking away from the two soldiers working at the relay, saying that fear was simply information, and that the only mistake was letting it decide what she did next, instead of simply informing the decision. The device was disarmed with less drama than I expected. A final quiet click, followed by a small green light replacing what had been, moments before, a steady pulsing red. Kell's engineer let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob, and Corporal Vale sat back on his heels, running a hand over his face before offering the Krazaxi engineer a small, exhausted smile that needed no translation at all. Hartley allowed herself exactly one moment of visible relief, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again, already moving on to the next necessary task. She ordered a full sweep of every remaining relay station on the ship, unwilling to assume that only one device had been placed, and Kell, without any hesitation this time, agreed immediately, his earlier caution replaced entirely by the shared urgency of the moment. As the search teams dispersed to check the remaining relays, Hartley turned to me and asked whether I still believed, after everything I had seen that day, that the story my government had been telling about her for 3 years bore any resemblance to the woman standing in front of me. I did not have a ready answer, because the honest truth was that I no longer knew what to believe, only that the files I had built no longer matched the evidence in front of my own eyes. She did not press me for an answer. She simply nodded, as though she had expected exactly that kind of honest confusion, and said that the council session would need to reconvene once the sweep was complete, that whatever remained of the day's agenda would have to wait until every corner of the station had been checked and cleared. I agreed, though my mind was already elsewhere. already turning over the deeper question that would occupy the rest of my time on that station. The question of what kind of person could order the destruction of an entire fleet on one day and kneel in wreckage to save a stranger's child on another, and whether those two things were truly as contradictory as I had always assumed them to be. The sweep of the remaining relays took the better part of 6 hours, and by the time the final section was cleared, exhaustion had settled over the entire station like a second layer of atmosphere. I expected the council to reconvene immediately once the all-clear was given, since the formal signing of the ceasefire had already been delayed twice that day, first by the explosion, and then by the discovery of the hidden device. Instead, word came through Braxis that the session had stalled entirely, and that no one, not even General Kell, seemed to know where Admiral Hartley had gone. I volunteered to find her, partly out of the same instinct that had made me follow her into the cargo hold earlier that day, and partly because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that a Krizaxi observer might find her more easily than her own officers, who were busy managing the fallout of the sweep and the mounting frustration of delegates who had been kept waiting far too long already. I checked the medical bay first, reasoning that the cuts on her hands from the earlier rescue might have finally required attention now that the immediate crisis had passed. She was not there. I checked the observation deck and the temporary quarters assigned to her senior officers, and neither held any sign of her. It was only when I passed the entrance to the nursery wing a second time, intending simply to check whether the rescued hatchlings were resting well, that I heard her voice through the partially open door, low and unhurried, carrying that same murmuring tone I had heard 3 times already that day. I stepped inside quietly, uncertain whether I was intruding, and found her seated on a low stool meant for Krizaxi caretakers, her long legs folded awkwardly to bring her closer to the floor. Across her lap lay one of the 2 hatchlings rescued from the cargo hold, the smaller one, who had been too frightened to reach for anyone at first, now nursing calmly from a small feeding bottle that had clearly been improvised from human medical supplies, adapted somehow to match the nutritional needs of a species she had never fed before that day. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The council chamber, only 2 levels above us, sat in restless silence, delegates from both sides growing increasingly frustrated at the delay, unaware that the reason for the stall was not some hidden political maneuver or last-minute demand, but simply this: an admiral feeding a rescued child because the caretakers assigned to the nursery were still occupied managing the aftermath of the sweep, and she had apparently decided that a hungry, frightened hatchling mattered more than a room full of officials waiting to sign a piece of paper. She noticed me eventually, glancing up without any visible embarrassment at being found in such an unguarded moment, and asked, quite simply, whether the council had sent me to retrieve her. I admitted that they had grown concerned by her absence, and she nodded, adjusting the angle of the bottle slightly, as the hatchling shifted against her arm, explaining that the formula had needed adjusting twice already, that the first mixture the ship's medical staff prepared had been too rich for a Krizaxi digestive system, and had nearly made the poor creature sick. I asked, because I could not stop myself, why she had not simply handed this task to one of the many caretakers or medical staff available on the station, why an admiral responsible for an entire fleet, in the middle of negotiating the most important treaty of the war, would choose to spend these particular hours with a bottle in her hand, instead of a data slate. She considered the question for a moment before answering, her attention still mostly on the hatchling rather than on me, and said that the caretakers had their hands full with the other children, that the nursing staff on her own ship had prepared the formula and understood its dosage better than anyone else on the station at that hour, and that frankly, after everything that had happened that day, she needed exactly this, a task simple enough to complete without anyone getting hurt. I did not know what to say to that. I had spent 3 years building a file on a woman I believed to be without mercy, without hesitation, without anything resembling the tenderness I was watching her show a child of a species that had been trying to kill her crew for the length of the entire war. I asked, finally, whether she resented the Krizaxi people for the losses her fleet had suffered, whether some part of her held this small-scaled creature responsible, even unconsciously, for whatever grief the war had cost her personally. She looked at me directly then, and something in her expression told me the question had struck closer to something real than I had intended. She said that she had lost people she loved in this war, Soldiers under her command whose names she still read aloud every year on the anniversary of their deaths, and that resenting a child for the actions of adults it had never met would be exactly the kind of thinking that had kept this war going for 3 years longer than it needed to. She said that hatred was easy, that hatred asked nothing difficult of a person, but that holding a frightened child steady while it fed required something else entirely, something she had decided, somewhere in the middle of this endless war, was worth choosing, even when it was harder than the alternative. The hatchling finished feeding as she spoke, and she shifted it gently against her shoulder, patting its back with slow, practiced motions, until a small sound, something between a hiccup and a sigh, escaped it, and its wide eyes finally began to droop, with the particular exhaustion of a very young creature who had survived a very frightening day. I watched her continue to hold it long after the feeding was finished, simply rocking slightly on the low stool, and I understood that whatever the council upstairs believed about the reason for this delay, the truth was far simpler and far stranger than anything they could have imagined, and far more difficult, I suspected, for my own people to accept once word of it spread. A second caretaker entered the nursery quietly, while Hartley continued to hold the sleeping hatchling, an older Krizaxi man named Doran Vess, whose scales bore the faded markings of someone who had served this station for many cycles. He stopped short at the sight of a human admiral seated on a caretaker's stool, and I saw the same confusion cross his face that must have shown on my own not long before. Hartley greeted him with a small nod, careful not to disturb the sleeping child, and asked whether he wanted her to hand the hatchling over now, or whether it would be less disruptive to let her finish settling it first. Vess seemed unable to answer for a moment, simply staring at the scene in front of him, and then he said, quietly, that in all his years caring for hatchlings on this station, he had never once seen anyone outside the caretaker service handle one with such natural care on the very first attempt. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether she had children of her own, and Hartley's expression shifted slightly, something private crossing her features before she answered that she did not, that the war had made certain choices for her, long before she was ready to make them herself, but that she had spent enough years commanding young soldiers barely out of their own childhoods to learn what frightened creatures needed most, regardless of species. I found myself asking, unable to hold the question back any longer, whether it bothered her to be called the Undertaker by my own people, whether the weight of that name pressed on her the way I imagined it would press on anyone forced to carry a title built entirely from other people's fear. She was quiet for a long moment, still rocking the sleeping hatchling gently, before she answered that names given by frightened people rarely described the person wearing them, only the fear of the person doing the naming, and that she had stopped taking such names personally a long time ago, though she admitted, with a small, tired smile, that this particular one had taken longer to let go of than most. She explained, slowly, and with none of the reluctance I expected from someone discussing their own reputation, that the battle my people remembered most vividly, the one at the Syndral Straits where 12 capital ships had burned, had not been a battle she chose. She said that her fleet had been ambushed there, caught in a formation designed to trap and destroy them entirely, and that the outcome, 12 enemy ships destroyed against 3 of her own, had been the result of a desperate defense rather than a calculated massacre. She said this without any attempt to minimize the loss on my side, without diminishing the grief that battle had caused across my own people, only offering the context that had never made it into any of the reports I had studied. I admitted, and it cost me something to admit it aloud, that my own files had described that battle very differently, framing it as an unprovoked act of aggression meant to demoralize Krizaxi forces ahead of a larger offensive. Hartley did not seem surprised by this. She said that war rewrote its own history on both sides, always in whatever shape best served the side doing the writing, and that she had long ago stopped expecting either government to tell the full truth about anything that happened on a battlefield, including their own actions. Doran Vess, still standing near the entrance, asked quietly whether he could take a moment to fetch the other caretakers, explaining that several of them had expressed doubt earlier that day about allowing any human near the nursery wing at all, doubt that he suspected might soften considerably if they witnessed what he was currently witnessing himself. Hartley agreed without hesitation, though she added, almost as an afterthought, that she had no interest in performing kindness for an audience. that she would have done exactly the same thing whether anyone was watching or not. I believed her when she said this, and I believe it still, writing this account long after that day ended. There was nothing in her manner that suggested performance, no calculation in the way she held that sleeping child, no awareness of how the scene might read to observers or council members or war scholars compiling reports for their own governments. She simply continued the small, careful work of comforting a frightened creature, entirely unconcerned with whether the gesture would be remembered or reported or believed by anyone beyond the walls of that quiet nursery room. It was nearly another hour before she finally handed the sleeping hatchling to a rested caretaker and rose from the low stool, her knees clearly stiff from the awkward position she had held for so long. She thanked Vess for his patience, apologized for the delay her presence had likely caused among the other caretakers waiting to check on their charges, and turned to me with the particular focus of someone whose mind had already returned fully to the matter of the stalled council session upstairs. She asked whether I thought the delegates would understand the reason for her absence, or whether the delay would simply be read as further evidence of human unreliability by those already inclined to distrust the process. I told her honestly that I did not know, that some among the council, particularly Ordrin, and those who shared his suspicions, would likely seize on any excuse to paint her actions in the worst possible light, regardless of the truth behind them. She nodded, unsurprised, and said that she would rather be honest about where she had been and accept whatever judgment followed than invent some more politically convenient explanation for her absence. As we walked together back toward the council chamber, I found myself turning over, once again, the strange contradiction I had spent the entire day trying to reconcile: the woman capable of ordering devastating military action, standing beside the woman who had just spent an hour rocking a frightened alien child to sleep, without any audience to witness or reward the gesture. I began to understand, walking those corridors, that perhaps these were never truly contradictions at all, but simply two expressions of the same underlying discipline, a refusal to let either the horror of war or the tenderness of peace become anything less than fully considered, fully deliberate choices. The council chamber doors came into view ahead of us, and beyond them, I knew, waited a room full of delegates growing more frustrated by the minute, unaware that the woman they were about to accuse of disrespecting the process had simply been feeding a rescued child because no one else was available to do it in that particular hour, and had considered that task worth every minute of delay it caused. Ordrin was on his feet the moment we entered, his sharp voice cutting across the chamber before either of us had reached our seats. He demanded to know where the Admiral had been, suggesting, with barely concealed satisfaction, that her absence during a moment of crisis proved exactly what he had argued from the beginning, that human commitment to this peace process could not be trusted beyond the length of a carefully staged rescue performed in front of witnesses. Hartley did not sit down to answer him. She remained standing at the edge of the table and told the room, plainly and without embellishment, exactly where she had been and why. She said she had been in the nursery wing, feeding one of the rescued hatchlings because the station's caretakers were occupied managing the aftermath of the sweep, and that she had judged a hungry, frightened child a more urgent priority in that hour than a treaty document that had already waited 3 years and could wait 1 hour longer. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence, and I watched Ordrin's expression shift from satisfaction to something more uncertain, clearly having expected a defensive excuse rather than a flat, unapologetic statement of fact. Before he could recover enough to press the point further, General Kell spoke, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who rarely wasted words on matters he considered already settled. He said that he had spoken with Doran Vess only minutes ago, and that the caretaker had confirmed everything the Admiral described, adding, with visible reluctance in his own voice, that Vess had described the scene with something close to admiration rather than suspicion. Ordrin sat down without further argument, though his expression remained tight with unresolved doubt, and Colonel Ashby used the pause to steer the session back toward the treaty itself, suggesting that the delegates review the security provisions Hartley had proposed earlier, now updated to reflect the joint response teams that had proven effective during the relay sweep. The mood in the room, while still tense, had shifted subtly, the earlier hostility softened by the simple, undeniable fact that no performance had been staged, that a woman with an entire fleet under her command had simply chosen to feed a frightened child rather than rush back to a negotiation that would happen regardless of a short delay. It was during a brief recess, called so the delegates could review updated documents before the final vote, that I found myself alone with Hartley, near a viewport overlooking the damaged docking ring, still visible in the distance, workers already beginning repairs under floodlights that turned the wreckage silver against the darkness of space. She stood quietly for a while, watching the slow work of repair, before she spoke again, this time without my prompting. She told me about the ledger, a private record she had kept since her second year of command, listing every casualty her decisions had caused, on both sides of the war, updated personally rather than delegated to any aide or officer. She said she read every name aloud once each year, on a date she did not share with me, alone in her quarters, because she believed that a commander who could not bear to hear the cost of her own decisions had no business making them in the first place. She said the ledger included Krazaxi names as well as human ones, that she considered every death her decisions caused to be a debt owed regardless of which uniform the fallen had worn. I asked whether keeping such a record made the decisions easier or harder to make, and she answered that it made them exactly as hard as they should be, no more and no less, that the danger for any commander was not making difficult choices, but making them without feeling their full weight, and that the ledger existed precisely to prevent that particular failure in herself. She said that her own crew called her the debt collector, rather than the undertaker, a nickname she found far more honest, though she admitted she had never corrected the record among people who feared her, since fear itself sometimes served a purpose she was not above using, when the alternative was losing more lives to a war that refused to end. I found myself telling her, in turn, about my own work before the war, the years I had spent studying the migration patterns of ancient Krazaxi settlers, work that had felt important once, before the fighting began and my skills were redirected towards something far less gentle. I told her that I had taken this observer assignment partly out of duty, and partly out of a desire to prove, to my own superiors and perhaps to myself, that understanding an enemy well enough could prevent the kind of catastrophic misjudgment that had extended this war far longer than it needed to last. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me since that day, that understanding an enemy well enough to predict them was valuable, but understanding them well enough to imagine what might make them stop being an enemy at all was rarer and more difficult, and infinitely more useful in the long run. She said that she suspected I had already begun doing exactly that, whether I had intended to or not, simply by choosing to stand beside her in that council chamber, when doing so carried real risk to my own standing among my people. Our conversation was interrupted by Bennett, who approached with visible urgency, informing Hartley that station security had identified a possible match for the strategist General Kell had named earlier, a Krazaxi civilian transport that had docked at the station 3 days before the ceremony, under a falsified registration, still berthed in an outer section of the station that had not yet been included in the earlier sweep. Hartley's expression sharpened instantly, the quiet, reflective mood of our conversation replaced immediately by the focused urgency I had already come to recognize as her default state whenever real danger presented itself. She asked whether the transport had been searched, and Bennett confirmed that a joint team was already moving toward it, delayed only by the need to coordinate with Kell's forces, rather than risk another moment of unilateral action that might reignite the very suspicions the earlier cooperation had worked so hard to ease. Hartley nodded once, already moving toward the door, and asked me to remain in the council chamber this time, to help manage whatever reaction the delegates would have if word of this development reached them before the situation was fully understood. I agreed, though reluctantly, watching her leave the chamber with Bennett at her side, and I understood, standing alone near that viewport with the damaged docking ring still visible in the distance, that whatever calm the last hour had provided was about to be tested again, and that the strategist behind all of this, a man who had already proven willing to risk the lives of children to make his point, was unlikely to surrender quietly, now that his hiding place had finally been found. The delegates began returning to the chamber within minutes, and I could see immediately that word of the development had already begun spreading, despite our attempts to contain it, whispered between aides and translators faster than any formal announcement could travel. General Kell arrived last, his expression grim, and he confirmed to the room what I already suspected, that he had authorized his own personal guard to join the joint team moving toward the outer berth, unwilling to leave the capture of his former officer entirely in human hands, though equally unwilling to act without the cooperation he had promised only hours before. Ordrin used the moment to renew his objections, arguing that the delay in searching the outer berths in the first place proved a dangerous lack of thoroughness in the earlier sweep, though this time his accusations found less traction among the other delegates, several of whom had clearly begun to shift their assessment of the day's events after witnessing Hartley's unwavering honesty during the earlier confrontation. Colonel Ashby reminded the room, calmly and without visible frustration, that the outer berths had been scheduled for inspection precisely because the initial threat assessment had prioritized areas closest to the nursery and the central corridors, a decision that had, in fact, led directly to the discovery of the transmitter and the disarmed device, and that hindsight rarely offered fair judgment of decisions made under the pressure of an active threat. I found myself called upon to translate several exchanges that grew heated between Krazaxi delegates, uncertain how to feel about a former war hero turned saboteur, some expressing sympathy for a man who had lost everything to this war, even as they condemned his methods, others demanding immediate and severe consequences, regardless of his personal losses. I did my best to convey not just the words but the underlying uncertainty in the room, the sense that many delegates were grappling, in real time, with the same contradiction I had spent the entire day trying to resolve in my own mind, the difficulty of holding both grief and accountability in the same understanding of a person's actions. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Bennett returned to the chamber alone, her expression tight with the particular frustration of a mission that had not gone entirely as planned. She reported that the joint team had reached the outer berth to find the transport already powered down and abandoned, its false registration confirming the connection to the strategist, but offering no sign of the man himself. A quick search of the vessel's systems had revealed a log of recent departures, suggesting he had left the transport on foot sometime in the last several hours, likely disguised among station personnel during the chaos following the first explosion. The chamber absorbed this news with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. Relief that no immediate confrontation had turned violent, anxiety that a man capable of planning 3 separate acts of sabotage remained somewhere within the station, indistinguishable now from any other Krazaxi worker or delegate moving through its corridors. Bennett added that Hartley had remained at the berth with General Kell to review the transport's cargo manifest and communication logs, hoping to find some indication of what the strategist intended next, and that both commanders had asked for the council session to continue without them, rather than delay the treaty vote any further than it had already been delayed. I found this decision remarkable, though perhaps I should not have by that point in the day. Neither commander had insisted on personally overseeing the remainder of the negotiation, each apparently trusting the other's deputies enough to proceed without their direct supervision, a level of confidence between two sides that had spent 3 years trying to destroy one another that would have seemed impossible to me only that morning. Colonel Ashby called the session back to order, and the delegates resumed their review of the security provisions, though I could see the strain of the day etched into every face around that table, human and Krazaxi alike, all of us aware that the danger had not passed so much as changed shape, hidden now, somewhere among the very people meant to be protected by whatever agreement we were all working so hard to finalize. It was nearly 2 more hours before Hartley and General Kell returned together, both looking exhausted but resolute, and I saw immediately that something in the manifest or the logs had given them a lead worth pursuing, though Hartley chose to share it with the full council, rather than keep it private between commanders. She explained that the transport's final communication before going dark had included a partial message referencing a secondary rendezvous point, a location that matched the coordinates of an abandoned research platform, drifting in the same system, decommissioned years before the war began, and largely forgotten by both governments since. General Kell confirmed that he recognized the platform's designation from old military records, a facility once used for joint scientific research before the war had ended all such cooperation, and he admitted, with visible discomfort, that if the strategist intended to use it as a base from which to continue his campaign against the peace process, the isolation of the location would make any assault against him considerably more dangerous than anything attempted on the station itself. Hartley agreed with this assessment, and proposed, to the visible surprise of nearly everyone in the chamber, that any operation to secure the platform should be conducted jointly, with both human and Chrysaxi forces committing equal numbers to the mission. A genuine test of the cooperation both sides had only begun building over the course of that single, exhausting day. The Council voted, after considerable debate that I will not recount in full detail, to approve the joint operation, with even Ordrin abstaining rather than voting against it outright. A small but significant shift in a man who had spent the entire session searching for reasons to distrust the process. As the vote concluded and preparations began for what all of us understood would be the true test of everything the day had built toward, I found myself standing again beside Hartley, watching the chamber empty as officers from both sides began coordinating the details of an assault neither side could have imagined conducting together only a day before. She looked tired in a way I had not seen since the first moments after the explosion, the accumulated weight of an entire day without rest finally showing plainly on her face. And yet when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady resolve it had held since the moment I first heard it over the emergency channel. She said that whatever happened at that platform would determine far more than the fate of one bitter strategist, that it would determine whether the trust built over this single difficult day could survive its first real test under fire, and I understood, hearing her say this, that the story I had come to this station to observe was no longer simply about her, but about all of us, learning together, in the space of one long and dangerous day, whether the peace we had been fighting so hard to reach was actually possible to hold. I was not meant to join the operation. My role, as an observer, was never intended to include combat of any kind, and every reasonable protocol suggested I remain on the station while soldiers from both sides handled the assault on the platform. But Hartley requested my presence directly, arguing to General Kell that if the strategist could be reasoned with at all before force became necessary, a Chrysaxi voice he might recognize as something other than an enemy could prove more valuable than another gun aimed in his direction. Kell agreed, reluctantly, and so I found myself strapped into a jump seat aboard a combined assault shuttle, flanked by human soldiers on one side and Chrysaxi soldiers on the other, all of us silent as the small craft detached from the station and began its approach toward the drifting research platform. The platform itself emerged from the darkness slowly, a cluster of aging modules connected by narrow access tubes, most of its exterior lights long dead, only a handful of windows glowing faintly against the black, evidence that someone had recently restored partial power to a facility meant to have been abandoned for years. Hartley reviewed the platform schematics one final time with General Kell, both of them tracing likely paths through the structure with quiet, focused voices, while Pierce checked equipment along the row of soldiers, and Bennett coordinated with a second shuttle, carrying additional Chrysaxi forces that would approach from the opposite docking arm. We landed without incident, the shuttle's thrusters barely disturbing the silence of the derelict platform as it settled against an old docking clamp that groaned in protest but held. The soldiers moved out first, human and Chrysaxi together, weapons ready, but discipline evident in every measured step, no one rushing ahead of the formation, despite the tension radiating through the group. I followed close behind Hartley, my heart pounding in a way that made the earlier fear in the cargo hold feel almost gentle by comparison. The interior of the platform was cold, the air recycling systems clearly running at minimal capacity, just enough to keep the atmosphere breathable rather than comfortable. Our combined team moved through darkened corridors lit only by handheld lights, and the dim emergency strips still functioning along the floor, every sound amplified by the emptiness around us, every shadow suddenly suspect. We found the first sign of recent habitation in what had once been a research lounge, a makeshift camp of blankets and ration containers, still warm enough that whoever had been resting there could not have left long before our arrival. It was Pierce who spotted the movement first, a shape retreating quickly down a side corridor toward the platform's old command center, and the formation shifted instantly, soldiers moving to cut off alternate routes, while Hartley and Kell led the direct pursuit. Careful not to lose the advantage of surprise, but equally careful not to rush into an ambush that could easily be waiting in the narrow corridors ahead. I stayed close behind them. My presence, I understood, meant for exactly this moment, whatever confrontation was about to unfold. We found him in the command center itself, standing before a bank of old consoles that flickered weakly with restored power, a tall Krazaxi man whose scales had faded with age and grief, rather than simple time, his posture rigid, with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided how this confrontation would end, and was merely waiting for the moment to arrive. He did not reach for a weapon when we entered, and Hartley, noticing this immediately, signaled for her soldiers to hold their positions, rather than close in aggressively. He spoke first, addressing General Kell directly, his voice carrying the rough edges of exhaustion and old sorrow, rather than the cold fanaticism I had expected. He said that he had hoped Kell would understand, of all people, why this peace could not be allowed to stand, why signing away the war meant signing away the meaning of every loss it had cost, including the loss that had ended his own family, in a strike he still believed the humans had known was coming. Kell answered him gently, more gently than I expected given everything the man had done, saying that he understood grief perhaps better than anyone else in that room, but that turning grief into more grief, more children lost, more families broken, honored no one and nothing, least of all the family this man claimed to be avenging. Hartley spoke next, and I watched the strategist's eyes shift toward her with open hostility, for the first time since we had entered the room. She did not defend herself against whatever accusations he might have been prepared to level at her personally. She simply told him, plainly, about the 2 hatchlings his sabotage had nearly killed in the cargo hold, about the 3rd child pulled from the wreckage of the docking ring, and asked him whether their deaths would have brought his own family back, whether any number of new graves could undo the ones that already existed. The question landed harder than any threat could have, and I watched something crack in the man's rigid posture, the fanaticism I had expected revealing itself, underneath, to be simply unbearable grief that had never found anywhere safe to go. He did not surrender easily, he argued, his voice rising with the particular desperation of someone defending a belief he was no longer entirely certain of himself, that the humans would never truly honor this peace, that some future crisis would inevitably reignite the war regardless of any treaty signed today, and that at least his actions, however costly, would be remembered as resistance rather than surrender. Hartley answered this with something I had not expected from her, an admission that she could not guarantee the peace would last forever, that no treaty in history had ever come with such a guarantee, but that the alternative he was offering, endless war justified by the fear that peace might eventually fail, condemned generations of children on both sides to a certainty of loss in exchange for only the possibility of avoiding it. The standoff might have ended in violence regardless of these words, had it not been for what happened next, a small sound from the corridor behind us, followed by the sight of Doran Vess, the caretaker from the nursery, stepping cautiously into the command center, having insisted, against every protocol, on joining the operation once he learned its purpose. He said the strategist's name aloud, the same name Kell had spoken quietly in that corridor hours before, and reminded him, in a voice thick with old familiarity, that he had known the man's mate personally, had held his children when they were still small enough to fit in one arm, and that those same children, wherever their memory now rested, deserved better than a father remembered as the man who tried to murder more children in their name. The strategist's resolve broke fully at these words, his weapon, which none of us had seen drawn until that moment, lowering slowly from where it had been hidden along his side, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of grief he had clearly been carrying alone for far too long. He did not resist as Kell's soldiers moved forward to take him into custody, his eyes fixed instead on some point in the middle distance, already retreating into whatever private darkness had driven him to this platform in the first place. As the soldiers led him away, Hartley remained still for a long moment, watching him go, and I saw in her expression not triumph, not relief exactly, but something closer to the particular exhaustion of someone who understood that catching one broken man solved only the immediate danger, not the deeper grief that had created him, grief that existed, I suspected, in dozens of other hearts across both our peoples, waiting for its own chance to turn into something destructive if given the opportunity. We returned to the shuttle in near silence, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining out of the assembled soldiers, replaced by the quiet, complicated relief of a crisis, finally resolved without further loss of life. General Kell walked beside Hartley for most of the return journey, the two of them exchanging quiet words I was not close enough to hear clearly, though I understood, watching their postures, that whatever passed between them in that conversation marked the true beginning of something neither side had managed to build in 3 long years of fighting. A working trust forged not in the signing of any document, but in the shared work of protecting the same children from the same danger. The journey back to the station felt considerably shorter than the journey out, though I suspect that was simply the effect of exhaustion compressing time, rather than any change in the distance itself. I sat quietly near the rear of the shuttle, watching the soldiers around me, human and Chrysaxi seated in loose clusters that no longer bothered to separate by species the way they had during the outbound flight, some of them speaking quietly to one another in the halting mixture of languages that had become common currency over the course of that long day. Doran Vess sat near me for part of the journey, his hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation in the command center, and he told me, in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it clearly, that he had known the strategist for nearly 20 cycles before the war began, had attended the small ceremony marking his bonding to his mate, had held both of his children within days of their hatching. He said that watching the man he once knew dissolve into the broken figure we had found on that platform felt like watching a slower version of the same violence the war had already done to so many others. Grief simply given more time to finish its work. I asked him whether he believed the man could ever be reached again, whether whatever remained of the person Vess had once known might still exist beneath the wreckage of what the war had made of him. Vess considered the question for a long time before answering that he did not know, that some wounds ran deeper than any single act of mercy could heal, but that he intended to visit him in custody regardless, because abandoning someone entirely, even someone who had done what this man had done, felt like accepting that the war had won a victory it did not deserve. When we finally docked back at the station, word of the successful operation had already spread through the corridors, and I saw relief written openly on faces that had spent the entire day braced for worse news. The rescued hatchlings, now fully recovered from their earlier fright, had been brought briefly to the docking bay by their caretakers, apparently at the insistence of several of the younger station staff who wanted the returning soldiers to see, immediately upon their return, exactly what their efforts that day had protected. Hartley knelt briefly beside the smallest of the 3 children rescued over the course of the day, the one from the ring, and allowed it to press its small clawed hand against her own, before rising again to address the gathered soldiers and staff. She kept her words brief, thanking everyone present, human and Chrysaxi alike, for a level of cooperation she said she had not been certain was possible even that morning, and acknowledging, without minimizing it, that the day had cost real fear and real danger to nearly everyone standing in that bay. She did not claim credit for the operation's success, crediting instead the joint teams, the caretakers, General Kell's willingness to trust an alliance neither side had fully tested before, and, to my considerable surprise, my own contribution as an observer willing to stand beside people my own government had trained me to view only as enemies. The council reconvened one final time that evening, exhaustion visible on every face around the table, though the mood had shifted entirely from the suspicion and hostility that had defined the earlier sessions. Ordrin, when called upon to speak, offered no further objections, saying only, in a voice notably quieter than his earlier tone, that he would need time to fully reconsider positions he had held since the war began, an admission that carried more weight from a man like him than any enthusiastic endorsement could have offered. General Kell moved that the treaty be brought to a final vote without further delay, and Colonel Ashby seconded the motion, and one by one, delegates from both sides raised their hands, or their equivalent gestures of assent, until the vote stood overwhelmingly in favor of the agreement that had nearly been destroyed before it could even be properly signed. Hartley and General Kell signed the physical document together, an old-fashioned formality that felt, after everything the day had cost, considerably more significant than it might have seemed only 24 hours earlier. I watched the 2 of them shake hands afterward, a gesture that carried none of the practiced diplomacy such moments usually held, but something that looked, instead, like the exhausted respect of 2 people who had spent one very long day discovering that their supposed enemy was, in fact, entirely capable of choosing mercy under exactly the same pressures that might have justified cruelty. As the chamber finally began to empty, delegates drifting toward whatever rest they could find after such a day, I found myself standing once more beside Hartley, near that same viewport overlooking the docking ring, now dark except for the steady work lights of the repair crews, still laboring through the night. She looked at the wreckage for a long moment before speaking, saying quietly that she intended to add 3 names to her ledger that night. Not casualties this time, but the 3 hatchlings whose survival she considered her responsibility to remember just as carefully as any loss. A debt of gratitude rather than grief, though she said she was not yet certain her private record had ever before included an entry of that particular kind. I told her, because it felt important to say aloud before this long day finally ended, that I intended to write an entirely different report than the one I had originally been sent to prepare, one that would describe not the monster my government had spent 3 years fearing, but the woman I had actually watched work through that day, capable of devastating decisiveness when danger demanded it, and equally capable of the quiet, unwitnessed patience required to comfort a frightened child with no one watching to reward the effort. She thanked me for that, simply and without false modesty, and said that whatever the future held for the peace we had just barely managed to save, she hoped reports like mine might eventually outnumber the ones that had shaped her reputation until now. 3 weeks passed before I saw Admiral Hartley again, weeks spent on my homeworld defending my revised report against colleagues who found it far easier to believe the old stories than the account I had actually witnessed with my own eyes. I will not pretend that changing minds proved simple. Some of my superiors accused me of being compromised by proximity, suggesting that spending a single dangerous day beside a skilled commander had left me vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation my training was meant to guard against. I answered each accusation the same way, by pointing to the note found in that cargo hold, to the transmitter recovered from the maintenance corridor, to General Kell's own testimony before the full council, evidence that no clever performance could have fabricated on such short notice. Slowly, and not without considerable resistance, the truth of that day spread beyond the station itself. The story of the 2 rescued hatchlings became known among ordinary Chrysaxi citizens, not through any official announcement, but through the quieter channels that always carry the stories governments would rather control. Caretakers speaking to their families, soldiers speaking to their friends, until the tale of the human admiral who sat feeding a frightened alien child, while her own council waited, had traveled further than any formal press release could have managed. I heard it repeated back to me, weeks later, by a stranger on public transit, who had no idea I had been present for the events themselves, already shifted slightly in the retelling, softened at some edges and sharpened at others, the way all stories change once they leave the hands of those who lived them. I returned to Calais Bay Station for the formal follow-up conference held 1 month after the ceasefire had been signed, a smaller, calmer gathering than the chaotic day that had nearly destroyed the agreement before it began. The docking ring had been fully repaired by then, new metal gleaming slightly brighter than the surrounding structure, a visible scar that would fade slowly as the station's systems weathered it back to an ordinary shade over time. I found Hartley in the same nursery wing where I had first discovered her feeding that frightened hatchling, though this time the mood in the room was considerably lighter, several caretakers moving easily between human and Chrysaxi visitors who had come simply to check on the children's continued well-being. The 3 rescued hatchlings had grown noticeably in the month since the crisis, no longer the fragile, frightened creatures we had pulled from wreckage and cargo containers, but sturdier, more confident young ones who greeted Hartley's return with the particular delighted recognition that very young creatures reserve for people they have decided, somewhere in their small growing minds, belong to their circle of trust. The smallest one, rescued from the docking ring itself, reached for her immediately, and she lifted the child without hesitation, the same careful, practiced motion I remembered from that first terrifying day, though this time performed without any urgency at all, simply the easy comfort of familiar routine. Doran Vess approached us both as we stood watching the children, informing Hartley that the nursery staff had voted, unanimously and without any prompting from station leadership, to name a new wing of the facility after her, a modest gesture that nonetheless carried enormous weight, given how deeply my own people had feared her only weeks before. Hartley seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond to this news, and I found myself smiling at the sight of the woman my people had once called the Undertaker looking, for the first time since I had met her, entirely unprepared for a situation. She asked Vess, eventually, whether the honor might instead go to the caretakers themselves, the people who did this work every single day, without any recognition beyond the quiet gratitude of the families they served. arguing that her own contribution had been a single difficult day, while theirs represented a lifetime of steady, unglamorous devotion. Vess told her, gently but firmly, that the decision had already been made, and that refusing it now would only deprive the staff of a gesture they had chosen freely, out of genuine feeling, rather than any political calculation. Hartley accepted this with visible discomfort but no further argument, and I understood, watching her struggle with the weight of unearned praise, that this discomfort itself told me more about her character than any battle record ever could. I asked her, during a quiet moment while the caretakers busied themselves elsewhere, what she believed had changed most significantly since that first chaotic day. She considered the question carefully before answering that the treaty itself mattered less, in her estimation, than the small, accumulated moments of trust built between individuals who had been taught for years to fear one another. Moments like Corporal Vale, kneeling beside a Krizaxi engineer, to disarm a device neither fully understood alone, or General Kell agreeing to a joint operation against his own former comrade, rather than insisting on unilateral Krizaxi authority over the matter. She said that treaties could be broken by future governments with the stroke of a pen, but that the kind of trust built in a cargo hold or a command center, forged under real danger rather than comfortable diplomacy, tended to prove considerably harder to unmake. I told her, then, something I had been considering since that long first day, that my own people's fear of her had never truly been about cruelty at all, despite the reputation her military record had built. I said that what we had actually feared, without fully understanding it ourselves, was precision, the particular terror of an opponent who did not act out of anger or hatred, but out of calculated, disciplined judgment, a mind that made devastating decisions, not because it enjoyed destruction, but because it had determined, coldly and carefully, that destruction was the only path available in that specific moment. I said that this same discipline, applied instead to mercy, produced exactly the woman I had watched feed a frightened child with the same unwavering care she had once applied to defending her fleet at the Syndrel Straits. Hartley listened to this without interrupting, and when I finished, she said that she had never considered her own reputation in quite those terms before, though she admitted the observation rang true to something she had felt, but never fully articulated about her own approach to command. She said that she had always believed war and mercy demanded the same underlying discipline, a refusal to let emotion, whether rage or sentiment, override careful judgment, and that perhaps this was the quality my people had sensed and misunderstood as coldness, when in fact it was simply consistency, the same mind applying the same standards regardless of which side of a conflict currently required her attention. We walked together through the repaired docking ring later that day, the new metal still slightly brighter than its surroundings, and she asked whether I intended to continue my work as a liaison between our two peoples, now that the formal ceasefire had become a lasting treaty. I told her that I did, that the work felt more meaningful now than any academic study I had conducted before the war, because it involved not simply understanding a culture from a comfortable distance, but actively building something new between two peoples who had spent 3 years trying to destroy one another, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found their way toward something better instead. She told me, as we reached the observation deck overlooking the newly repaired ring, that she intended to keep visiting this station regularly, not for diplomatic obligation, but because she had grown genuinely fond of the 3 hatchlings whose lives had become unexpectedly tied to her own on that difficult first day, and because she believed that the fragile trust built between our peoples needed continued tending, the same way any young and vulnerable thing required patient, consistent care in order to grow into something strong enough to last. I think often, even now, of that first terrifying day, of the woman I expected to meet and the woman I actually found kneeling in wreckage with bleeding hands, feeding a frightened child while a war council waited in confused frustration, 2 levels above her. I think of the strategist we found broken on that abandoned platform, a man consumed entirely by grief that had never found anywhere safe to go, and I wonder sometimes how differently his story might have unfolded had someone shown him, at the right moment, the same patient care Hartley showed those rescued hatchlings, without any expectation of reward. The galaxy had been told, for 3 long years, that a human warship's arrival meant nightmare, meant destruction, meant grief beyond measuring. I understand now that this was never entirely false, that Hartley's fleet was indeed capable of terrible, decisive violence when violence became the only remaining option. But I understand also, having watched her closely on that impossible day, that the true nightmare humanity represented to my people was never cruelty at all. It was the discovery that an opponent capable of such devastating strength could also choose, freely and without any performance for an audience, the harder and quieter work of mercy, and that this same discipline, turned toward peace instead of war, might prove more powerful than any weapon either of our peoples had ever built. That, I have come to believe, is the true story worth telling, not a tale of monsters arriving to end a galaxy, but of an Admiral bottle feeding rescued cubs while a council stalled in confusion above her, and of everything that single quiet choice eventually taught two exhausted peoples about what peace, if it was ever going to last, would actually require of all of us. I visited the strategist once, several months later, in the quiet detention facility, where he had been held since his surrender on that abandoned platform. I went alone, without informing Hartley beforehand, uncertain even as I requested the visit whether I intended to offer him comfort, or simply to understand, once and for all, how a man who had once held Vess's newly hatched children in his own arms had traveled so far from that gentleness. He looked older than I remembered from the command center, the fury that had animated him that day replaced by something quieter and more exhausted, closer to grief, settled into its permanent shape, rather than grief still raging against its own existence. He asked me, before I could ask him anything, whether the treaty had held. I told him that it had, that trade routes long closed by the war had reopened, that families on both sides had begun the slow work of rebuilding lives, interrupted by 3 years of fighting neither side had truly wanted in the first place. He was quiet for a long time after I told him this, and when he finally spoke again, he said that he did not know whether to feel relief or renewed grief at the news, since a lasting peace meant that his own family's deaths would forever exist without the justification he had spent years building for himself, the belief that their loss served some larger purpose in an ongoing struggle, rather than simply representing a tragedy without meaning. I told him, as gently as I could manage, what Hartley had said to me that first exhausting day, that hatred asked nothing difficult of a person, that it offered an easy shape for grief to take, but that the harder work, the work that actually honored the dead, involved choosing something else entirely, something that did not require more graves in order to feel meaningful. I do not know whether my words reached him in any lasting way. He did not respond to that particular observation, turning instead to ask after Vess, whose name he spoke with a tenderness that told me some part of the man I once knew as a friend, before the war reshaped him into something else, still survived somewhere beneath the wreckage of everything that had happened since. I told him that Vess had, in fact, requested to visit, that the old caretaker had never fully given up on the possibility of reaching whatever remained of the person he once knew. The strategist's composure broke slightly at this news, a crack appearing in the careful stillness he had maintained throughout our conversation, and he asked me to tell Vess that he would welcome the visit, though he warned that he could not promise to be the same man Vess remembered from those quieter years before the war began. I told him that Vess had never expected otherwise, that showing up despite uncertainty was, in my limited experience of these last months, exactly what genuine care actually looked like in practice. I left that visit with a clearer understanding of something I had struggled to articulate since that first chaotic day on HFY Station, the recognition that the line between monster and mourner is often thinner and more permeable than either side of any war likes to admit, that the same grief capable of driving a man toward violence remains capable, given the right conditions and the right patience from people willing to offer it, of eventually finding its way back toward something gentler. I do not excuse what he did. The families of those who nearly died in that docking ring deserve better than easy forgiveness offered on their behalf by someone who was not among the injured. But I understand him now, in a way I could not have managed before that long, difficult day taught me to look past the easy categories of enemy and ally, monster and hero, toward the more complicated truth underneath. Admiral Hartley continues her visits to HFY Station, and I have joined her on several occasions since that first assignment ended, no longer required by any official duty, but choosing to return simply because the work of tending this fragile peace felt, and still feels, more important than any other task I might otherwise be assigned. The 3 rescued hatchlings have grown considerably since that first day, old enough now to ask questions about the events that first brought a human admiral into their small, sheltered lives, and I have watched Hartley answer their curious questions with the same patient honesty she offered every difficult question put to her that first exhausting day, never softening the truth into something more comfortable than it actually was, but never burdening young minds with more weight than they were ready to carry either. I keep my own version of her ledger now, a habit I adopted after hearing her describe the private record she maintains, though mine tracks something different, not casualties but moments of unexpected trust built between our 2 peoples in the months since the treaty was signed, small instances of cooperation and understanding that might otherwise pass unremarked in the larger sweep of galactic history. I read through these entries sometimes, late at night, when doubt creeps in about whether the peace we built that day can truly outlast the political pressures already beginning to test it, in smaller, quieter ways, across both our territories. And I remember, whenever that doubt grows loudest, the image that started all of this, an admiral my people had spent 3 years fearing, seated awkwardly on a low caretaker's stool, patiently working air bubbles out of a bottle, so a frightened alien child would not grow sick from feeding too quickly, entirely unaware that anyone was watching, entirely unconcerned with whether the moment would ever be recorded or remembered by history. That image, more than any treaty document or council vote, remains for me the true beginning of whatever lasting peace our 2 peoples eventually managed to build together. Proof that the same discipline capable of ending a war remains equally capable, when given the chance, of gently and patiently building something better in its place.